Okay. I'm sorry about this. Okay, now okay. So I didn't realize. Okay, so what I've been doing is I wasn't broadcasting. I was in what was called the green room. Okay, so I wasn't even broadcast. Yeah, I am sorry about that. I've been doing this and I didn't realize that it wasn't actually going. Okay, so mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. Okay, so that is that's our okay. Sorry about that. Okay, sorry, and I've been telling people. Okay, wow. All right. So I thought that I've been talking to y'all for like the last 10 minutes, and I actually was not. All right. So yeah, that's our issue there. Okay. So yes. Okay, Amanda, sorry about that. I thought I was live. I was in the green room. Okay. So as far as that goes, let me get back to what I was saying. Now, according to this poll, over about 75, let's see, about 80% of you are on the American Revolution and the Articles and the Constitution. So some of the questions that are about like the Tariff of Abominations and Jacksonian democracy, stuff like that. Y'all are like way ahead of where other people are. So that kind of stuff I'm not going to get to. Thank you. Thank you. The chair was only $3.99, right? That's a PewDiePie for you. So as far as that goes, yeah, I mean, I have to spend a lot of time tutoring broadcasting, so I might as well have a good chair. So anyway, I'm going to be focusing on questions that are about that time period. Now, Jackson, what in the world is this? Okay, how did American society change from 1650, 1800? How did it remain the same? It sounds to me like your teacher gave you an LEQ for homework and you're trying to get me to do that for you. Okay, not why we're here. Okay, remember that we're not here right now to do your homework. Wait, okay, do other people have audio? Okay, so the audio is working. All right, so it sounds like that is okay. If you're experiencing trouble with the audio, that's on your side. Okay, so everybody's getting this clear. Again, sorry about the mix-up. I thought that I was broadcasting and I was in the green room. All right. So as far as that goes, all right, we see some stuff here. Jefferson, Hamilton, unicameral, bicameral. Okay, that's why I couldn't start answering the questions earlier. Okay. So when I was thinking I couldn't start answering the questions, I wasn't broadcasting live. Okay, everything's working now. All right. So as far as that goes, let me go ahead and go back here. Okay. And all right, and I'm going to share my screen, just kind of start over here. All right. Now, I believe last time, those of you who were here last week, did we spend some time talking about the Articles of Confederation? Let's see. Do y'all have questions about the Articles of Confederation? Okay, so or should I get to, straight into the Constitution? All right, so I'm going to go ahead and, yeah, of course you don't, Donna. You're a teacher. You shouldn't have any questions about the Articles of Confederation. All right, so as far as that goes, let's just kind of get into the Constitution. All right, yeah, I'd be a little worried if she did. All right, so as far as that goes, the Constitutional Convention. Now, the thing is, the Articles, the elite consensus, most of the elites in America at the time felt like the Articles were not working. Okay, the Articles weren't working. So why aren't the Articles working? Now, first of all, there's a bad economy. Wars will do that to you, especially if you're on the side that's not as well financed. There's a bad economy. These Continental Notes, not worth a Continental. Shays' Rebellion. The other thing is that if there is civil unrest, okay, if there's civil unrest in a state and a state can't muster enough force to put that down, how do we deal with that? Because under the Articles, there was really nothing to handle civil unrest. Now, remember that really with the Articles of Confederation, what you're looking at there is essentially a military alliance. All right. So when you're thinking about the Articles of Confederation, you're thinking in terms of a military alliance. It really wasn't that much different than NATO or something like that, except a little bit tighter than that because they declared war, they sent common ambassadors. So you wouldn't have an ambassador from South Carolina or from Massachusetts. You had an ambassador from the United States. So the main job of this government under the Articles was to conduct foreign policy. And so now what do we add here? Now somebody asked something about tariffs. Now what we're seeing here is under the Articles that the states had complete control over commerce. All right, the states had complete control, and so the federal government didn't really have any kind of, I mean, that's really until the 20th century. The federal government under the Constitution financed itself mostly through tariffs. And so that's what's going on at that time. And yeah, it's mostly tariff financed. And so with that, before the Constitution, there was really no way for the federal government to finance itself because they didn't have the ability to tax. Now, also, North Carolina could put a tax on, let's say, tobacco from Virginia or something like that. So the states had complete control over tariffs and commerce, which some of that's going to be yielded to the federal government later on. Now, the Annapolis Convention is something that's good to add to just to know about as an antecedent for the Constitutional Convention. You're not really going to need to know like the specifics of what went on there, but it was a meeting of representatives from about 5 states or so. Now, there was also, let me just real quick, there was a question. Yeah, so Brittany, the Newburgh conspiracy, just real quick. Now, this is an example of something that'll never be on your exam. Like, you're not going to see it. But it was a conspiracy of Continental Army officers who were planning something of a military coup during the time of the Articles. And then George Washington went to their meeting, and he went to their meeting, and he had a prepared statement, and he took out his spectacles and he put them on. And as he was putting on his spectacles, he said, "My apologies, I have gone blind in the service of my country." And then it was like, ooh, and that pretty much shut that down. Hey,
time to eat.
Okay. Well, I think that's going to need to wait for a little bit.
Okay.
You want to say hey to everybody?
Oh, hi.
All right. Thank you, Caroline. Okay. But anyway, it's a cool little story and something that is not going to be on your exam. All right. And so when we see the tariff of abominations, again, that's something that's really kind of outside of the scope of where 80% of the people that are like way outside of the scope of where I think when we add that up, like 90% of the people here aren't there. So as far as that goes, the Annapolis Convention is an important antecedent for that. And so let's meet again next year with more people. So that's the Philadelphia Convention. Now, the Philadelphia Convention, what's very important as far as your big understanding about the Constitution is that the Constitution is a product of numerous compromises. And that's important because, they make compromises at the convention, and then they make compromises after the convention during ratification. And so with that, the stated purpose of the Philadelphia Convention was to amend the Articles of Confederation. Okay. So as far as that goes, amend the Articles. Now, we know that's not going to happen, okay? This is something that it ends up getting a lot bigger than that. That the Philadelphia Convention ends up going way beyond its mandate of amending the Articles, and they end up creating a completely new document. And that's, of course, our Constitution. And so they start from scratch with this. And then as far as understanding the Constitutional Convention, I think of it, some of y'all are familiar with Dr. Seuss, right? And, one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish. Think large state, small state, slave state, free state. Okay, so you've got a compromise between the large states and the small states, and then a compromise between the slave states and the free states. And these are the biggest compromises that are made here. And so as far as that goes, you've got, these large states. Now, Virginia, you can see, let me zoom in here, that Virginia has 20% of the population. Now, but note here that 39% of that population is 39% of that population is enslaved. All right. And so the thing is, if this new government is not going to count those people in terms of population, that could be a problem if representation is determined by the by the population. And so south of the Mason-Dixon line, of course, you see some of these states have quite a bit of slave population. Now, as far as that goes, so when you look here, you see the northern states. Now you've got Massachusetts, you've got Pennsylvania, which are the larger states there. And of course, when you look at the slave population north of the Mason-Dixon line, only 6% of the population, whereas 15% south of the Mason-Dixon line, and of course, concentrated in states like North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia, okay, and Georgia. So really, yeah, it looks like here, Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia really having the most, in Maryland. So with that, every state's coming there with their own agenda, and they want to get as good of a deal as possible. So the legislative branch, that is Article 1 of the Constitution. And so the biggest thing is, how are we going to constitute Congress? And so how do we share power? For example, if my wife and I are sharing a dessert, how are we going to split that? Are we going to split it 50-50, or are we going to split it proportionally? I might think, hey, I'm bigger, I should get more, right? And so this is where you see the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan. Now, I've got everything on the New Jersey plan written in small letters here. Now, the Virginia plan was proposed by James Madison, and he proposed a bicameral legislature. Now, there is a question here about that. Jackson has asked me, what is the difference between a unicameral and a bicameral legislature? Now, that means, I guess, cameral means house in Latin, okay, because unicameral means one house, bicameral means two houses. And the federal government has a bicameral legislature, which means we've got the Senate and the House. So we've got two houses, and both houses have to pass legislation in order for something to become law. Now, this is supposed to be a check on the legislature and make the legislative process more difficult, and that consensus building should play a role in this. Okay, so when you're looking at unicameral versus bicameral, I believe 49 states have bicameral legislatures. I think that Nebraska has a unicameral legislature, if I'm not mistaken. And so, yes, the bicameral legislature means that we have two houses. So with this, the Constitution, now the Articles had a unicameral legislature. The Congress was just one house. You didn't have a two-house legislature. So with that, we're done answering that one. And so James Madison, with the Virginia plan, has a plan for a bicameral legislature, and it's based on population. Whereas William Patterson, now he's trolling a little bit here. There are some of you who are probably familiar with trolling. And what William Patterson and New Jersey, now you don't necessarily need to know Patterson's name for the exam. James Madison would be good, but you'll probably never see William Patterson come up by name. But a unicameral legislature with one vote per state. Now, the thing is, isn't that what we have right now? Okay, so New Jersey plan is like, weren't we here to amend the Articles? What is the, what is the deal here? And so, we should be here to amend the Articles, and that's what we want to do. And so you've got this impasse. Now, of course, Hamilton's plan is worth mentioning, but kind of as an aside, because we really need to understand where Alexander Hamilton is coming from. And remember that this was a secret meeting. All right. So this was a secret meeting. So what everybody said, what happens in Philadelphia stays in Philadelphia. And Hamilton proposed this idea for a national government. So he said, how about we create a government that just makes the states they're accountable to the federal government. All of the sovereignty is with the federal government, and the states are basically administrative districts, kind of like if you look at France, where they've got their departments and that sort of thing. Those departments in France, they're not states because they don't have any of their authority, but they are organizations of local government. Now, Hamilton's plan was not taken very seriously by the convention. This is not why they were there. Now, the Constitution represents a major change from the Articles, and it adds powers to the central government, but it does not destroy federalism, this idea that the state should have powers that are theirs and the federal government should have powers that belong to it. And so with that, the convention heard Hamilton's plan, didn't debate it. So really it comes down to the Virginia plan versus the New Jersey plan. And with that, we've got the Great Compromise. Roger Sherman of Connecticut. As long as you know Great Compromise, you should be fine. But it never hurts if you like trivia and stuff like that. Okay, so as far as that goes, we see the Great Compromise. And what he says here, now this is bicameral, but remember that Madison's plan had both houses being determined by population, and this plan came from the largest state. This was the large state plan. And so what Roger Sherman proposes, how about the House of Representatives, the lower house, is based on population? Whereas the Senate, the upper house, you have 2 senators from every state. And so with that, they're saying, okay, this will satisfy the large states and the small states and have a consensus. Now, the other thing about the upper house, the Senate, is that the senators are going to be appointed by state legislatures. And this is another thing to note. I've actually got a podcast that I'm editing right now, and I'm really going into how our Constitution was not really created to be a democracy. Now, it was created to have democratic elements, all right, so that there should be an element of democracy in the Constitution, but the Senate was intentionally designed to be a more aristocratic body. And this is where you see with the current, with the Kavanaugh hearings, that's going on in the Senate. The House doesn't get to advise the president on things like judicial appointments. That stuff is done by the Senate. And so then the House of Representatives, that is the House of Representatives, that is the Democratic House. So you have a combination of aristocracy and democracy, which is what the framers intended. And of course, the United States has become a more democratic country, but the foundation of our government is not democratic. You look at most European democracies, they haven't gone with our system of government. They've gone with the parliamentary democracy system, which is really built around the idea of democracy and majority rule and that sort of thing. But the Senate, of course, when people say the Electoral College isn't democratic, I say, well, if you think that, you might want to look at the Senate, because the Senate is less democratic than the Electoral College, okay? Because California gets 2 senators and Wyoming gets 2 senators, even though California has several times the population. So the next question is the slave states versus the free states. And so should slaves be counted for purposes of representation? And so what happens here is the 3/5 compromise. Now, you don't have to know this for your exam necessarily, that this comes from a funding formula. Like as far as the states, when money was requested of them, the slaves would count as 3/5 of a person or something like that. But you can understand where the southern states want to make sure that they're represented, because if you only have the free population of the southern states, they're not going to have a whole lot of representation in the House. And so then again, if you have slaves counted, and then you start thinking, if you're from the North, like, are you going to let them vote? Are they citizens? Like, are you really just trying? I mean, you want to treat them like property legally, but you want them to count toward representation. So you can see that there is some resentment here on the part of the North, but the delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, they're threatening to walk out. So that's why the Constitution, it's not the document that anyone wanted per se, but it's the document that people could agree on that were in this room with the result of some give and take. And of course, you have another round of give and take during ratification. So slaves will be counted as the 3/5 of a person. And then after 20 years, Congress has the power to regulate or outlaw the international slave trade. And they did. In 1807, Congress did exactly that. All right. So as far as that, then the executive branch. Now, one thing that we need to remember as well is that the Articles did not have a dedicated executive branch, and there was no federal court system. And so a president of the United States, to have somebody that is the person who is in charge of administering the government, that this is going to be a single individual. They debated several things like, do we want to perhaps make this a committee or something like that? Now, how do we elect this president? It is through the Electoral College. One of these days, I want a shirt that just says Electoral. And it's just, there you go. That's where I went to college, right? Don't apply to the Electoral College. Don't let anybody talk you into applying to the Electoral College. Now, as far as that goes, this is how we elect the president. So each state will send electors to vote for the president. And as far as that goes, now, the Electoral College is not strictly speaking a democratic, like national election, but the Electoral College is the sum total of 51 distinct democratic elections. And this is what we have to understand about the election of the president under the Constitution. It's not a national election. We want to remember the difference between national and federal. And so the Electoral College was designed to be a federal system. So the states send their votes, okay? So even today, it is the electoral vote. So the states send their electors depending on who won the presidential election in that state. And so each state will get a number of electors where it is the number of senators plus the number of representatives. So for example, my state of South Carolina has 7 representatives, and so therefore we've got 9 electoral votes. So you add the senators. Now, why do they do this? It's one of those things that the large states get more electoral votes. All right, the large states so California gets more. Okay, California gets more than Wyoming, but the small states get a head start. So if you live in Wyoming, your vote, Wyoming's say in who's president is proportionally larger. Now, in real terms, it's much smaller, but it's proportionally larger than California. So when you look here at the 2012 presidential election, you see California has 55 electoral votes, but then Wyoming, Montana, North and South Dakota, Vermont, you've got several of these states here that only have 3 or 4 electoral votes, and Wyoming gets 3 electoral votes for like 500,000 people that live in Wyoming. And so proportionally, those small states get a little bump, but then again, states are impacted by presidential elections. And so then, that's where you see kind of how we see them in their electoral power. Now, the judicial branch. So the Supreme Court of the United States, and the judicial branch is really not, it's not as well defined. It really just says there will be a judicial branch, there will be a Supreme Court and lower courts that Congress can establish. Now, the Commerce Clause is very important. So when we're talking about tariffs, as far as going from the Articles of Confederation, where the states had complete control over commerce and the federal government had 0 economic powers. What happens here is that the Congress will have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with Indian tribes. Congress will control interstate commerce. Now, what's important here to note is that the states will still control intrastate commerce. So again, we see federalism because with the Commerce Clause, the states, if commerce originates in the state, then and it is done all in that state. That's why you pay a sales tax. Like when you go somewhere and you buy something, a physical good that is in the state, well, that's intrastate commerce. Now, then when you're putting goods across state lines, states cannot charge sales taxes on that. Now, then the other thing is amending the Constitution, because the articles were nearly impossible to amend because you had to have everybody, all 13 states had to agree. And so what happens here is they want it to be difficult to amend, but not impossible to amend. And so we see that 2/3 of Congress, now we could talk about the Article 5 convention, which has never happened, but it may happen at some point. The states can actually have another meeting to propose amendments. But every amendment so far that we've had has gone through Congress. So 2/3 of Congress plus, so Congress basically proposes amendments. Now remember, Congress cannot amend the Constitution unilaterally. Congress cannot amend the Constitution. They can only propose and then send it to the states. Now, 3/4 of the states have to be on board with this. So the states ratify or reject an amendment. So as far as that goes, Madison is saying here that the amendment process, it needs to be enough to where we can have, where we can amend the thing, but not so much to where the thing's being amended all the time. So that's the thing. And so as far as that goes, you see the Constitution is taking sovereignty, not just to the states, but it's shared. Foreign relations. The federal government holds on to all powers that it had previously. As far as taxation, now the federal government and the state governments can tax. The Commerce Clause, interstate commerce, and then representation, the House and the Senate as the result of the Great Compromise. A concurrent majority, instead of just 2/3 of the states, a concurrent majority of the Senate and the House, and the president's signature. And instead of needing the consent of all the states to amend, 2/3 of Congress plus 3/4 of the states. Now, let me go ahead and go back to the questions. All right, so we've got some things here. Let's see, the Great Compromise. Okay. I don't think, Brittany, that we will see the Great Compromise as the Sherman Compromise. I don't think that we're going to see Roger Sherman on your exam. And so the Great Compromise, and you may not even see it referred to as that, but this compromise between, and really remember that 60% of your APUS history exam is stuff that you generate. Okay, so Brittany, remember that on the multiple choice, it's all put there in front of you, but the majority of the exam is you generating your own evidence. So as far as that, now, if you said the Sherman Compromise, they'd probably know the reader would probably know what you're talking about. But yeah, typically you would say the Great Compromise. And so as far as that, the significance, okay, the upper and the lower house. Now, as far as that goes, the upper and the lower house, it's really more symbolic than anything else. Now, remember that the Senate has a few powers, like we see with the confirmation hearings, treaties go before the Senate. So the Senate is known as the upper house really because of its prestige. All right, the Senate is more prestigious than the House. Like if you say, like, I'm a U.S. senator, that has more clout than if somebody says I'm a U.S. representative. So, but both houses have to approve any legislation that passes Congress. So the Senate doesn't really have any grounds to, like, they can't overrule the House on something, and any more than the House can overrule them. So, and then also all revenue bills, all bills that have to do with taxes have to start in the House. But that's getting into some AP government stuff. But as far as that, the Senate is the upper house because it's more prestigious. And remember initially that senators were appointed by state legislatures. All right. Did the Constitution make who more united? What more united? I just see them. All right. Okay. So the thing is that now this is something, Jackson, that what I would say here is to note that perhaps the American Revolution made things more democratic, but it's really more republicanism. And that's nuanced. We're a democratic republic, but you can have a republican form of government and a government that's responsive to the people without it being a democracy. And so as far as that goes, that really the Constitution, what you'll see from the Anti-Federalists who are arguing against the ratification of the Constitution, is they're saying that the Constitution it's not democratic enough, that it's actually decreasing the amount of democracy and decreasing what the average person can do. All right. So as far as that, I would say that we want to note that the Anti-Federalists did say they claimed that the Constitution as it was not democratic enough, that it actually undermined democracy. All right. So as far as that, now the Citizen Genet affair. All right. So understanding Brittany, I think that context is something that's very important here. Okay. That the context here is, of course, Washington's foreign policy. And I've got a video on this if you search for George Washington's foreign policy. Now, America had to figure out, like, where are we going to be? The United States, a new country, and separated from Europe by an ocean. Now, of course, Washington and Jefferson both end up seeing this as advantageous. Now, as Secretary of State, Jefferson is more likely to say we need to back France. Okay, we need to back France with this. But Washington was like, look, our best interests are actually in being neutral. So Citizen Genet, what he did, okay, so when you send ambassadors, so when a country, like when France sends an ambassador to the United States, they send an ambassador to the United States government, not to the people of the United States. All right. So the thing is, Citizen Genet comes to the United States and he knows that there's a lot of anti-British sentiment. So he starts having meetings with the people. He comes to South Carolina where all rabble rousers will go eventually, right? And he has these public meetings and he starts raising money and commissioning privateers, basically like, hey, I've got a boat. I want to help the French Revolution. I want to shoot at the British. And so he was signing people up. But remember, an ambassador is an ambassador to a country's government, not an ambassador to a country's people. So, like one time I actually found myself sitting down at a restaurant with the Canadian ambassador to the United States. He had a conversation with us, but sometimes he was careful about what he said because you don't want to be in a position where you're trying to influence the people who live in that country. So Washington dismissed Citizen Genet as the French ambassador. He said Citizen Genet is trying to drum up support for his country with the people rather than being a person who's coming to communicate with our government. The HBO John Adams series, it's about 10 years old, but it's really amazing and it goes into that. But basically, and Washington actually, Citizen Genet was like, please don't send me back to France. They're going to cut my head off with the guillotine. And Washington actually gave him asylum in the United States, told him you can stay here. You don't have to go back. And so Washington was pretty cool to him personally, but Citizen Genet went beyond what was permissible for someone who is an ambassador to a country. And so you need to understand that in the context of Washington trying to create a neutral foreign policy for the United States. All right. And as far as that goes, Kim, you're asking a republic and a democracy. Okay. Yeah. And so the United States is a democratic republic. And we, of course, have the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And when it comes down to it, we all believe in maybe some form of democracy, but we also believe in a Republican form of government. Now, a Republican form of government is a government that is responsive to the people. So if you've ever heard of the divine right of kings, it's like a divine right monarchy. The monarch gets his power from God and then rules the people because God wants him to. And so a Republican form of government, it is a government that gets its power from the people and it recognizes that its job is to serve them. Okay, it's to serve the public. And so so a republic does not need to be democratic. Okay, now democracy is majority rule. 50% plus one, we do whatever. And the United States is not a pure democracy because the United States, and that's where we get into the Bill of Rights, we see that even if most people in the United States are a certain religion, then we see that somebody's religion is protected. And so they don't, it's just no matter how many people are against that religious group, as long as that religious group's not violating the law, then they have the right to that religion. We have the right against unreasonable search and seizures. We have the right to speak freely. Excuse me. Our First Amendment expression rights. And so those are elements of republicanism, because a republic gets its power from the people, but it also has limits. And also a republic can be aristocratic. I've got a video on aristocratic and democratic republics. Those of you who are already in the 1820s, y'all might want to watch that video, because that's timely for y'all, because the United States was really founded as an aristocratic republic because it wasn't supposed to be a government that was controlled by majority rule. The whole point of the Electoral College, it was to put some distance between the president and the people, so that the president wouldn't be a faction leader and somebody who was subject to public opinion, but somebody who could run the government. So as far as that goes, that's really kind of the difference. Now, the United States being a democratic republic, we are a democracy, but then again, not totally. Okay. So as far as that goes, we've got that. Now, Jay's Treaty, that's another thing. Jay's Treaty is also in my video on George Washington's foreign policy. And the Jay Treaty was a very controversial treaty between the United States and Britain during the Washington administration. And so as far as that, the Jay Treaty, it was very unpopular. Basically, we gave the British most favored nation status, and in return, the British agreed to do things that they'd already agreed to do at the end of the Revolution. So it was one of those things that it didn't end up being a good treaty for the United States, and there were effigies people would burn of John Jay, like they would make a little straw man John Jay and they'd burn it. And the Senate approved the Jay Treaty 20-10, which if it would have been 19 to 11, it would have failed, because treaties have to get 2/3 of the Senate, the upper house, so they have that privilege of doing that. So as far as that's Jay's Treaty. And for more of that, look at my video on Washington's foreign policy. Thank you, Zoe. Okay, so as far as that goes, let's see. Can you explain what framers are? Framers, when we think about a house is built on a frame, right? And so when you frame something, you build it. And the framers of the Constitution, the framers of the Constitution are the ones who are putting together the Constitution. Think of the Constitution as a house. The framers are framing it. So the framers are the people who wrote the Constitution. When they talk about the framers' intent, it means, what did the people putting the Constitution together, making the Constitution, what did they do? What did they mean by this? All right. Where can we find these videos? Jackson, my videos are on YouTube. Just type in Tom Ritchie. Okay. So youtube.com/Tom Ritchie. Then you can go there, and that's where my videos are. I've got a YouTube channel that's got a lot of videos for APUSH and AP Euro. All right. So as far as that goes, what was the point of? Okay. Brittany, I'm not sure if I understand your question. That if they were going to follow the law anyway. Now, the big thing about the Alien and Sedition Acts is that they were a direct affront to the Constitution. So the Alien and Sedition Acts declared that any kind of scandalous or malicious speech against the government was going to be a crime. And that, of course, goes right against the First Amendment, which guarantees the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. And so as far as that, I don't think that Jefferson and Madison, I don't see the part of following the law. Now, Jefferson went so far as to write that it's, if the federal government commits an illegal action, an unconstitutional action, that the state can just ignore it. Okay, so this is the beginning of nullification theory. For those of you who are studying the 1820s and Jackson, nullification theory really has its roots in in the Virginia and Kentucky, or at least the Kentucky Resolution, because Madison did not subscribe to that doctrine. Madison believed that he was just interposing, that the state is coming between its citizens and the federal government, kind of a timeout sort of thing. But Jefferson was like, if the federal government passes an unconstitutional law, it's just the state has no obligation to pay it any mind. And that's, of course, where Calhoun is going to pick up and leave off. Now, remember, states' rights is kind of an interesting thing between the passage of the Constitution and the Civil War. It's almost like when you're at Chuck E. Cheese's and those little like gopher, that little game where the gophers are coming out of the ground and you're knocking at them. And so, there'd be a states' rights thing. And then it's like, bam. And you think, oh, states' rights went away. I got that. And then it's like, boop, states' rights. And then bam, bam. And it just keeps coming back. And you keep hitting it. It keeps coming back. And so there you go. All right. The XYZ affair it's not something that's a huge thing, but it is something that shows that the United States was basically being ignored by, there were tensions. You need to understand that as an episode in the quote unquote quasi war. And that's really the Alien and Sedition Acts and the XYZ affair and all of that kind of stuff. That's all part of this quasi war, this undeclared naval war between the United States and France. All right, so let's see here. Okay, let me go ahead and go to this one. Zoe's asking about the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the Federalist and the Anti-Federalists. And so these are the parties. They're kind of a temporary party system. It's not like a real party system in the sense that it's a long-term thing like with the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. But let me go ahead and pull this up for y'all and show you just a real quick thing here. Now, the Federalists, these are the people who supported the ratification of the Constitution. And they picked their own name here and then categorized their opponents as anti-federalists, which the irony here is that the anti-federalists actually were more federal in their view of a government. So the Federalists supported ratification. And what the Federalist Papers are asserting, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, what the Federalist Papers are asserting is that the government, the Constitution creates a government that is both federal and Republican. Now, by federal, we mean that it has room for the states, okay? Because the concern of the anti-federalists, they were opposed to ratification because they said the Constitution creates a government that is neither federal nor Republican. So they argued that this Constitution, it may look federal, but it's going to create a national government. They said things like the Supreme Court is eventually going to strike down laws passed by the states. Imagine that. And look how powerful that Supreme Court has gotten. Now, remember that the Federalist Papers, okay, now, but let me get, before I go to the Federalist Papers, but the Anti-Federalists said that this government is not federal. It is not a balance between the states and the central government, and it's not Republican. Now, remember, a Republican government just means that that government is responsive to the people. It's accountable to them. And so if a government is not Republican, then it is autocratic. It is aristocratic and monarchical. So you see the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now, the Federalist Papers, so before that, let me go ahead and note this question is answered. And let's see, the Federalist Papers, how much is needed to be known about them? Okay, so for this class, now, of course, for AP Government, you would get into things like the substance of Federalist 10, okay? So James Madison, who's writing in Federalist 10 about a large republic and a small republic and that sort of thing, Brutus #1. Now, for this class, I believe for APUSH, knowing Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, and knowing the overall purpose of the Federalist Papers, because the Federalist Papers, the point was not to explain the Constitution. The point was to actually, sell the Constitution. All right. So Hamilton is really really just, I mean, Alexander Hamilton was such a con artist. I mean, it's one of those things that he's writing like when Hamilton was like, this Constitution doesn't need a Bill of Rights or anything like that. We don't need this. And so as far as that goes, remember Hamilton's goal, his ultimate goal, and he showed his hand in the anonymous atmosphere of the Constitutional Convention. But he said, I want a national government. And that's what Hamilton's going for. And so with that, we see here Brutus, number one, the Anti-Federalists and all that. And so the Anti-Federalists are arguing you can't have a large republic. You only can have small republics. And this government is going to turn into an aristocratic monarchy or something like that, but some sort of autocratic government. So I don't think that necessarily for APUSH, somebody doesn't need to know like, oh, Madison wrote in Federalist 10, which they're going to need to know for AP government, but understanding the purpose of the Federalist Papers was to promote the Constitution and to try to get it ratified specifically in the state of New York, and understanding that who the Anti-Federalists were and what they were afraid of. Now, one thing that I think I've seen on APUSH questions before is understanding that the big point of contention that really the settlement, that's made between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists is the inclusion of a Bill of Rights. And so as far as this goes, when the Anti-Federalists said this government's going to be autocratic, well, it made a lot of Anti-Federalists happy when a Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. So that's something that we definitely want to note as far as that goes. All right, so let's see, going from that. Okay, and I think we've already got that, Logan, so we've already gone over them. Now, then I've mentioned that I've got YouTube videos, stuff like that. Now, as far as a similarity in Hamilton and Jefferson's ideals. Now, Julia, am I doing somebody's LEQ for them? I'm suspecting here. I've invited you on screen so you can chat with me if you'd like to. All right, let's see if she might join us. Because the thing is, they're really like Jefferson and Hamilton, like, now, of course, they both like the Constitution, even though that's not what either of them wanted. So Jefferson, one video that I've got on my YouTube channel is called Jefferson and the Constitution, Not Love at First Sight. So when Madison, Jefferson had no hand in writing the Constitution. He was actually in France as an ambassador at the time. And so with Jefferson, he looks at the Constitution. He's like, you know what? I kind of like this whole Montesquieu thing I've got going here with the three branches of government. I like that there have been some additional powers added because the government needed some additional powers. There are some things like you don't see Anti-Federalists railing about the Commerce Clause. There are a lot of people who thought that was necessary, and that the government needs to have the power to tax and stuff like that if it's going to be a legit government. And so as far as that goes, Jefferson's like, there are some things about this that I like, but there are other things that I'm not too crazy about. He didn't like that the original Constitution didn't have any term limits for the president or for the president or for Congress. Now, of course, we still don't have term limits for Congress, but we have term limits for the president now, thanks to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. And then, of course, for the 22nd Amendment after FDR broke that precedent. And so as far as that goes, Hamilton. So Jefferson's like, this is probably a little further than I would have gone. For Hamilton, this hasn't gone as far as I would have liked for it to go. And so they're both trying to kind of manipulate they're trying to push the Constitution their way, whereas Jefferson with the strict construction, Hamilton with loose construction. And as far as this goes, I think the biggest similarity would be that they both, at least I think Jefferson lost confidence in Washington later, but they both thought that George Washington was the best man to hold the country together at that time. But I'm guessing from the question here, Julia, I'm guessing that this is an LEQ prompt that y'all are having to do or something like that. But I would say that your exam will likely focus much more on the differences. But I do think that both Hamilton and Jefferson believed in a Republican form of government. That's certainly, but it's really, I mean, the philosophies are very, very different. And so the role of the tariff in the founding of the country. So remember that before the Constitution, everything was with the states as far as economic powers. And so because of the Constitution, the government can institute a tariff. Now, the thing that we want to understand about the tariff in early national America, and for those of you studying Jackson and nullification right now, that's something that we want to definitely look at. Okay, so Jefferson and Hamilton here, the whole idea with the tariff, okay, there are actually two types of tariffs. A tariff is a tax on imports. And so any tariff is a tax on imports. Now, there are two types of tariffs. There is a revenue tariff. Now, revenue is money coming in. So a revenue tariff is a tariff for the sole purpose of raising money for the government. Now, the Constitution says that the Constitution says here that the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and the general welfare of the United States. Now, this unquestionably constitutional. Now, a protective tariff. Now, this is a tariff that is not passed to fund the government, but it's passed, like we see President Trump is a fan of protective tariffs, that tariffs passed to try to protect American industry, especially manufacturing interests. And this is where Jefferson's a big fan of the farmers, and then Hamilton wants to promote manufacturing. And so with that, we see that the revenue tariff is intended to fund the government with no ulterior motive, whereas a protective tariff is intended to protect domestic industry and also to discourage imports. And that's where it gets messy with the nullification crisis, because it's very evident that the tariff of 1828, the tariff of abominations, was not a tariff that was designed to raise money for the government, that the government's like, okay, we'll just skim something off the top of something that's coming in, that these tariff rates were prohibitive to try to manipulate the economy. And Jefferson and his party are very laissez-faire. Now, I'm thinking that that would be a good topic next time to talk about the early republic, Jefferson and Hamilton, and all of that kind of stuff. Now, again, I'm so sorry about the late start of this thing. I was talking for about 10 minutes, and then I realized that I wasn't actually addressing y'all. Next time, I'll know that if I don't have the option to answer the question, to start answering the question, then I'm not broadcasting. So sorry about that. Mea culpa. Y'all go ahead and throw out to me. Are there any topics that y'all want to focus on? I'm thinking right now, seeing where y'all are, it's probably best if we focus on the administrations of Washington and Adams next time. So what we might call the Federalist era. And then we can move on to the Jeffersonians later on. But I'm thinking that's going to be fine. So, but I'll take questions from the Jefferson presidency. I'm sure people will probably be there later. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank y'all very much for joining us, and hope everything was helpful. And I will see y'all next week at the same time. It's always a pleasure. Austin Garrett. You're welcome, Zoe.